You understand me, don't you?
No, sir.
Bullseye!
For 9 seasons, Doug McClure rode into American living rooms every week as Trampas, the cowboy nobody could stay mad at. He was the easy laugh, the friendly face, the one character on the Virginian who never seemed to be hiding anything. That was the performance. The real Doug McClure was a much harder man to pin down. By the time the Virginian finished its run, he had already been married 3 times, was working on a 4th, and would eventually walk down the aisle a 5th time before his life was over. He built one of the longest careers in television history, then watched it nearly evaporate the moment his signature role ended, only to rebuild it twice more in genres nobody expected from him. This is the story of the gap between Trampas, the character America thought it knew, and Doug McClure, the man who kept starting over. Douglas Osborne McClure was born on May 11, 1935, in Glendale, California, to Donald Reed McClure and his wife Clara. Nothing about his upbringing pointed toward hardship. He grew up in a comfortable Los Angeles household, played quarterback for his high school football team, and spent much of his free time on a horse. Long before any casting director looked at him twice, Doug left home as a teenager to work on a Nevada cattle ranch, taking on the kind of physical, early morning labor that had nothing to do with a script or a soundstage. He tried his hand at the rodeo circuit as well, which meant that by the time Hollywood eventually cast him as a cowboy, he had already lived enough of that life to make the performance feel effortless. That authenticity would end up being the single biggest reason producers kept handing him westerns for the next 3 decades. He studied at UCLA, and by his own account, it was a high school play that first pulled him toward acting as something more than a hobby. A Hollywood advertising agent spotted him and got him into commercial work, and commercials led to television. His first credited screen work came in 1956, and within a year, he was already picking up small roles across shows like Death Valley Days, where he played 2 different characters in the same season, a common practice for young contract actors at the time. He also turned up in 3 episodes of the syndicated Western 26 Men and in a single episode of Mackenzie's Raiders, the kind of scattered, low-profile credits that rarely get remembered, but that quietly taught him how a television set actually worked, long before he ever carried one on his own. It wasn't a meteoric rise. It was a slow accumulation of guest spots and bit parts, the kind of grinding apprenticeship that either burns an actor out or quietly prepares him for something bigger. Along the way, he picked up a small role in the beach comedy Gidget in 1959, another example of a young actor taking whatever came his way while he waited for the part that would actually change things. In 1957, while filming the World War II submarine drama The Enemy Below alongside Robert Mitchum, Doug met an opera singer named Faye Brash. The two married that same year. Their daughter, Tane, was born not long after, at a point when Doug was still working to establish himself as a reliable television actor rather than a star. This first marriage lasted 4 years, ending in divorce in 1961, right as Doug's career was about to take its first real leap forward. It's a detail that tends to get lost in the mythology of Doug McClure the confident, grinning cowboy. Before America ever knew his face, he had already been married, become a father, and gone through a divorce, all while working steadily but anonymously in an industry that hadn't yet decided what to make of him. Later that same year, 1961, Doug married actress Barbara Luna. The two had crossed paths on the Western series Overland Trail, where Doug had landed his first real leading role as a sidekick named Frank Flippin opposite veteran actor William Bendix. Overland Trail only ran 17 episodes before it was canceled, but it proved something important to the industry. Doug McClure could anchor a series, not just support one. That proof mattered, because within months of marrying Luna, Doug moved into a new role on the detective series Checkmate, playing investigator Jed Sills for roughly 70 episodes. Between Overland Trail and Checkmate, Doug had gone from a face in the background to a recognizable presence on 2 different network shows in the span of about 2 years. Then came the audition that would define the rest of his career and quietly end his second marriage before it had barely started. Universal was adapting Owen Wister's classic novel The Virginian for television, and in Wister's original story, the character of Trampas is unambiguously the antagonist, a source of conflict for the book's heroic protagonist. When the show's writers sat down to build the pilot, they made a decision that would end up reshaping Doug McClure's entire career. Instead of keeping Trampas as a straightforward villain, they reworked him into a mischievous, warm-hearted cowhand, someone audiences could actually like. It was a gamble, handing a formerly villainous role to an actor who was, by all accounts, just as easygoing and funny off-camera as the character was meant to be on it. Colleagues who work alongside Doug during those years often said that a great deal of Trampas's charm came directly from Doug's own personality bleeding into the part, to the point where it became genuinely hard to separate the performance from the man playing it. The Virginian itself was an unusual bet for network television. NBC and Universal built the show around 90-minute episodes, at a time when nearly every competing Western ran 30 or 60 minutes. That extra length gave the series a scale and a production budget closer to a theatrical film than a typical weekly show. At first, Trampas wasn't even the emotional center of the series, which was built around the title character, played by James Drury, and Judge Henry Garth, played by Lee J. Cobb. But audience mail kept arriving for Trampas specifically, and the writers responded season after season by expanding his role until he became one of the show's most consistent draws, a character who could get into trouble, make mistakes, and still stay likable in a way the more serious leads never quite managed. The show ran for 9 seasons, from 1962 to 1971, racking up 249 episodes, making it one of the longest-running westerns in American television history. The cast changed constantly around him. Roberta Shore, who played Betsy Garth, left after season 3 to get married. Lee J. Cobb departed in 1966 and was replaced by Charles Bickford. Randy Boone, Gary Clark, and later a young Tim Matheson rotated through the ensemble as the show pushed into its final seasons, by which point it had even been retitled The Men from Shiloh. Through every single one of those cast changes, only 2 actors remained for the entire 9-year run, James Drury and Doug McClure. That shared endurance turned into a genuine, lasting friendship between the 2 men off-screen, one that reportedly continued for decades after the show ended, all the way until Doug's death. Drury would later say that he could never help smiling whenever Doug walked into a room, calling him the finest man he ever knew, the kind of tribute that says as much about how Doug treated people privately as any magazine profile from the era ever could. But while Trampas was becoming a fixture in millions of American households every week, the man playing him was going through his second failed marriage, and the pattern was only just beginning. Doug and Barbara Luna divorced in 1963, after roughly 2 years together, just as the Virginian was becoming appointment viewing across the country. It's worth sitting with that timeline for a moment. The show that made Doug a household name and the collapse of his second marriage were happening at almost exactly the same time. 2 years later, in 1965, right as the Virginian was reaching the height of its cultural popularity, Doug married Helen Crane. That marriage lasted only until 1968, roughly 3 years, ending in divorce despite Doug being, by any outward measure, one of the most successful and recognizable men on American television at that exact moment. There's a pattern here that becomes hard to ignore once you lay the timeline out plainly. 2 marriages started and ended during the single most demanding, most publicly visible stretch of Doug's entire career. A 90-minute weekly drama meant brutal production schedules, constant location shooting, and the kind of unpredictable hours that have ended plenty of Hollywood marriages before and since. Doug was often on set well before sunrise and rarely home before dark, and a series that ran 90 minutes rather than the usual half-hour or hour meant scripts that were longer, shoot days that ran later, and a production calendar with almost no room to breathe between seasons. Whatever specific tensions existed inside each relationship, the broader shape of Doug's life during the Virginian years was consistent. Enormous professional success running directly alongside repeated personal instability, with almost none of it visible to the audience, watching him play a cheerful, dependable cowboy every week. It's worth noting how differently these breakups played out compared to the tabloid narratives so many other Hollywood marriages of the era generated. There were no public feuds, no messy tell-all interviews, no lasting bitterness that followed Doug from one relationship into the next. By most accounts, the women he divorced continued to speak about him with a kind of warmth that's unusual for failed Hollywood marriages, suggesting that whatever pulled these relationships apart, it wasn't cruelty or scandal. It looked much more like the ordinary, exhausting math of a man trying to sustain a marriage while working the kind of hours the hit network show demanded, season after season, with no real end in sight. In 1970, a year before the Virginian finally ended its run, Doug married Diane Soldani. This marriage lasted considerably longer than the previous two, spanning 9 years and producing his second daughter, Valerie. For a while, it looked as though Doug had finally found the kind of stability that had eluded him through his 20s and early 30s. But even this relationship ended in divorce in 1979, making it his fourth marriage to collapse inside a span of roughly 2 decades. People who knew Doug during this period consistently described someone who refused to let the repeated failures turn him bitter or guarded. He kept opening himself back up to new relationships rather than retreating from them, treating each divorce as a closed chapter rather than a permanent verdict on his ability to build a lasting partnership. That persistence would eventually be rewarded, but not before Doug faced a professional crisis just as disorienting as anything happening in his personal life. When the Virginian ended in 1971, Doug McClure was only 36 years old, still young by industry standards, and Universal clearly still believed in him. He was quickly attached to a pilot called The Judge and Jake Weiler, co-starring the legendary Bette Davis. The project didn't generate enough interest to become a full series, and was ultimately released only as a standalone television movie. It was an early sign of something Doug would spend the rest of the decade navigating. Audiences had fallen in love with Trampas specifically, and getting them to follow the actor into a completely different role would prove far harder than anyone at Universal expected. He tried again in 1972 with Search, a science fiction detective series in which he alternated leading duties with Anthony Franciosa and Hugh O'Brien. The concept, investigators using futuristic surveillance technology to solve crimes, felt genuinely ahead of its time, and it drew some positive attention. It still wasn't enough to keep the show running past 2 seasons. Doug was running into a wall that plenty of television stars from his era hit sooner or later. Viewers were loyal to the specific character they'd spent years watching, not necessarily to the actor underneath the role, no matter how much range that actor actually had. Doug later described that stretch of his career with a joke rather than a complaint, saying he sometimes got the sense that people simply assumed he'd vanished from the industry altogether. In reality, he never stopped working. He kept showing up on sets, kept learning new lines, kept doing the job exactly the way he always had. What had changed wasn't his effort or his talent. It was how often the public actually saw him, since nothing in this stretch came anywhere close to matching a weekly series watched by tens of millions of households for 9 consecutive years. Rather than chasing another version of Trampas-level fame, Doug shifted his approach almost entirely, and the genre he turned to next had nothing to do with cowboys at all. In the mid-1970s, Doug became one of the more recognizable faces in a completely different corner of the industry. Mid-budget fantasy adventure films based on the pulp novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. In 1974, he starred in The Land That Time Forgot, playing a man stranded on an island where prehistoric creatures still roamed. Critics were unimpressed, but audiences showed up anyway, both in theaters and later in television syndication, and that modest success opened the door to more of the same. 2 years later came At the Earth's Core, co-starring horror icon Peter Cushing, which took audiences into an underground world of strange, hostile civilizations. In 1977, Doug returned to the character of Bowen Tyler for The People That Time Forgot, and by 1978 he'd added Warlords of Atlantis to the list as well. None of these films made Doug a box office giant. What they gave him instead was a steady, distinctive presence in a genre that would go on, decades later, to develop a genuinely loyal cult following among fans of vintage adventure cinema. Television work never slowed down during this stretch either. Doug appeared in Barbary Coast alongside William Shatner, took part in the acclaimed miniseries Roots, and picked up guest appearances across some of the biggest shows of the era, including Fantasy Island and Murder, She Wrote. He also became a familiar face away from scripted television entirely, appearing in a long-running series of commercials for Ham's beer through the 70s and 80s, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that kept a recognizable actor's name in front of audiences between bigger roles. In 1984, he even turned up in a comedic supporting role in Cannonball Run 2, a far cry from either cowboys or dinosaurs, but proof that Doug was willing to take almost any part that came with a paycheck and is set to show up on. His last major regular television role came between 1987 and 1991, when he played Police Chief Kyle Applegate on the fantasy sitcom Out of This World, introducing an entirely new, younger generation of viewers to Doug McClure without a single reference to Trampas or the Virginian anywhere in the show. Away from acting, those who knew him described a man who spent much of his free time around animals, occasionally lending his name to animal rescue causes, and who enjoyed poker enough to take part in celebrity tournaments when his schedule allowed. None of it was flashy. It was the kind of low-key, steady personal life that never generated headlines, which may be exactly why it rarely got mentioned in the same breath as his 5 marriages. On paper, it read as a genuine comeback story, built almost entirely on Doug's own willingness to keep showing up for smaller, less prestigious projects rather than waiting around for something on the scale of the Virginian to come along again. It was during roughly this same period, in 1979, that Doug's personal life finally found the stability that had eluded him for 2 decades. While working in England in 1979, Doug met Diane Funberg. The two married that same year, and unlike every relationship that came before it, this marriage lasted for the rest of Doug's life, 16 years, all the way until his death in 1995. Diane was the one by his side as his career settled into a quieter rhythm, and as his health, in time, began to fail. By most accounts, she became the steadiest presence of his final years, arriving only after 4 previous marriages had already run their course. In early 1994, Doug was diagnosed with lung cancer, a disease that had likely been developing for some time before doctors caught it. He responded to the diagnosis the same way he'd approached nearly everything else in his working life. He kept going. Rather than stepping back from the industry to focus on treatment, he chose to keep his condition largely private during the early months, continuing to accept roles and show up to sets in a way that meant most of his colleagues, and certainly most of the public, had no idea anything was wrong. That same year, he reunited on screen with James Drury for a Western reunion project and took a small supporting role in the big-screen remake of Maverick, starring Mel Gibson and James Garner, a film that carried an extra layer of meaning given that Doug had appeared in a minor role on the original Maverick television series decades earlier, right near the very start of his career. He also appeared in episodes of Burke's Law and Kung Fu. The legend continues around this same period, projects that, because of the timing of his illness, wouldn't actually reach television screens until after he had already passed away. Doug continued taking on new work throughout his treatment, reportedly telling people around him that he didn't want to be seen as a patient before he was seen as an actor. That determination culminated in one of the most meaningful moments of his professional life. On November 16, 1994, Doug received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for his contributions to television, dedicated at 7065 Hollywood Boulevard. By some accounts, he reported feeling a period of remission around the time of the ceremony and spoke publicly with optimism about his recovery. It would turn out to be his final public appearance. In early January of 1995, while filming an episode of the series, One West Waikiki in Hawaii, Doug collapsed on set. Colleagues initially feared a stroke, and he was flown back to Los Angeles for hospitalization. Tests revealed that the lung cancer, which he had been managing for more than a year, had spread to his liver and bones. Doug McClure died on February 5, 1995, in Sherman Oaks, California, at 59 years old, just months short of his 60th birthday. He was buried at Woodlawn Memorial Cemetery in Santa Monica. His final completed film, Riders in the Storm, was released only after he had already passed. There's one detail about Doug's life that says a great deal about how the people who actually knew him felt about him. Years after his death, the writers of The Simpsons built the character Troy McClure partly as an affectionate nod to Doug, blending his name and persona with fellow actor Troy Donahue's. According to people close to the family, Doug's own daughter mentioned that he had been a genuine fan of the show while he was alive, and that his children sometimes teased him by calling him Troy, just to get a laugh out of him. It's a strange kind of immortality for an actor to end up as an in-joke on one of the most successful sitcoms in television history. But by every account, Doug would have found it funny rather than insulting. His daughter Tane went on to build her own career as an actress and singer. His second daughter, Valerie, chose a quieter, more private path away from the industry that had defined so much of her father's adult life. Both kept his memory close in the years that followed, and Doug was also survived by his fifth wife, Diane, his mother, and a brother, a small circle that had watched him move through 5 marriages and roughly 4 decades in front of the camera. Looking back across the full arc of Doug's career, what stands out isn't just the longevity. Though more than 500 credited appearances across film and television is a staggering number by any measure. It's the sheer range of what he was willing to attempt once his defining role had run its course. Plenty of actors who land a role as iconic as Trampas spend the rest of their careers chasing that same character in slightly different packaging. Doug tried science fiction detectives, prehistoric adventure heroes, sitcom police chiefs, and dozens of guest spots on shows with nothing in common with westerns at all. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. All of it kept him working steadily for over 3 decades after the show that made him famous went off the air. Put the whole picture together, and what you get isn't the simple, easygoing cowboy America thought it knew from 9 seasons of The Virginian. It's a man who married 5 times, who watched 2 of those marriages collapse during the very years his career was at its most visible, who lost the biggest role of his life at 36 and spent more than a decade rebuilding his career from a completely different direction, and who, when a terminal diagnosis finally arrived, chose to keep working rather than step away. The public got Trampas, warm, funny, dependable, uncomplicated. The people closest to Doug got someone considerably more complicated than that. Someone who kept failing at marriage and kept trying again anyway. Someone who lost his signature role and quietly built an entirely new career out of dinosaur movies and guest spots rather than fading away. What makes the story land the way it does isn't any single scandal or secret, because by most accounts there wasn't one. There was no hidden second family, no exposed affair, no criminal record waiting to surface after his death. The double life Doug McClure actually lived was quieter and, in some ways, more relatable than that. A man whose public image never had room for the version of him that kept failing at marriage and kept quietly getting back up anyway. A version of him that only fully comes into focus once you line up the wedding dates against the premiere dates and see just how much was happening behind the scenes while Trampas was busy charming the entire country. Fame gave Doug an audience of millions who thought they knew him, and almost none of that audience had any idea how many times he'd already started over by the time they tuned in. So knowing everything that was actually happening behind that easy, sunlit grin, what do you think it was that finally let Doug McClure find the stability that took him almost 20 years and 4 marriages to reach? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this look behind the legend, give the video a like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of television. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.